please welcome our next speaker, Milan and Milan and Saša. Enjoy.
First of all, welcome, and thank you for being here with us on the talk. My name is Saša, and I'm a software developer at Xamarin, currently working on a project using the OutSystems platform. When I'm not obsessing about technology, podcast, news, or work, you can usually find me chugging beer and or playing board games somewhere. Hobbies, as you can see, both of us share.
Yes, hi, my name is Milan, and I'm also a developer at Xamarin. I've been developing mobile applications, especially using Xamarin platform, for several years now. When I'm not tapping on the screen, debugging the application, I spend my time with my friend here, tapping on beer, and slaying some dragons in dungeons. Not to be confused with something else. So actually, the idea for this talk came from our debates on and off work about these two platforms that we are actively using in our work. So, why are we all here today? In the next half hour or so, we will present to you one generic problem that every developer comes across, every mobile developer at least. So we will go through the development steps that you would encounter when developing mobile application, cross-platform mobile applications. What are some of the advantages for these platforms? What are the challenges? What you need to keep an eye out when developing these, using these platforms, and of course, how to choose pick the right platforms. Of course, these are some of our personal observations and conclusions from our experience when working with these platforms.
So the reason we have chosen these platforms in specific is, of course, our personal experience in projects with them, but also the lack of general exposure and knowledge regarding the cross-platform development itself. People are mostly still leaning towards native technologies when considering mobile apps and solutions, which is fine, but sometimes for a quicker, more efficient way, cross-platform development might be the answer you didn't know even existed. Sure, Xamarin and Xamarin.Forms are fairly well known, but we still wanted to add to the community, bring our own experiences and knowledges regarding the things we have seen and worked on. We are trying to dispel some of the unknowns and possibly cover some of the nuances of mobile development in general by using, like Milan said, something of a generic, more relatively fairly used example of a project you might encounter, especially with larger clients and mobile development in general. And another thing we wanted to explore is basically just trying to find some of the alternative possibilities and usher some new development options in our community, because people here are not that familiar with mobile applications and development in general, and we wanted to push them into basically trying to figure out some of these new technologies or just technologies in general and try to add to that community. Yeah, because that's mainly applications with mobile background are usually considered either games or some short-lived end-user applications that are going to be here just for a short time, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case, since they can be major projects for major clients that are trying to provide a new service or another platform for their services.
So what is this problem that you might encounter in your line of work? For example, a client comes to you or your company asking for a problem to be solved. He has an idea that he wants to implement. This is kind of like your initial contact with the client, what you need to ask them, what they want, what you need to solve for them. We will assume for the purpose of this presentation that it is some kind of large company with a fairly large budget. This can range from some kind of transport company to large industry giants, chemical, heavy industry, something like that. Of course, we will assume that our client is not an IT company. So we are free to use whichever technology stack that we see fit, that we are most comfortable with. So we will assume that they're in the process of modernizing their businesses. So also, we would need to connect to their existing database, their existing infrastructure, which can cause several difficulties when developing cross-platform applications and when using Xamarin.Forms, and we will go over them in the next slides. So, like I said, this is your initial contact with the client. It's like you're flirting with them. You need to find out what do they want from you, how to most efficiently solve their problem.
So after the initial negotiations are over, the planning stage of the development lifecycle can begin. And that is, in turn, one of the most important ones when considering working with the OutSystems. Why is that? Well, the entire application, entire platform is low-code domain model-based platform that you really need to have specific domain and data hammered out, details hammered out completely, so you can easily turn into development side of things without much problem and changes of the future in the future. One interesting thing to note is that the website for OutSystems has really good, guided tours and paths and a free trial you can use to basically quickly introduce new developers into your project, and the onboarding time is not all that scary and costly. And it covers web and mobile platforms, so that's a plus. And considering the fact that we are going to use the existing database structures, OutSystems also shines there because it provides us with ample opportunities to include external resources or external structures into our system, into our solution. There are numerous, connections and platforms supported, so you can basically connect to anything with the technologies you are usually used to. Sorry.
So for Xamarin.Forms side, discussing with the client, detailing out the domain specifics is also very important. I mean, that's important in every project that you work on. But why I am repeating this for Xamarin.Forms is that we probably can't emphasize enough how important this is, especially for cross-platform mobile development. If you don't hammer out all the details with your client to know exactly what they want, you can run into issues if you pick the wrong platform for the job. If your domain logic needs to be shared across platforms, that can be very, very challenging to do and difficult to do if you're going native. Different programming languages like Java for Android, Objective-C for iOS, they can have completely different implementation and completely different behavior. So you need to hammer out the details with your client when going cross-platform mobile development. Also, for Xamarin, you need to discuss with your client what platforms need to be covered. With Xamarin.Forms version 3, you have the ability to cover all desktop platforms and all mobile platforms. All desktop platforms also include the Linux platform, which is fairly new, and not many other frameworks can claim that. Also, different from example, OutSystems platform is that you do not have a backend or a database integration out of the box. You need to keep in mind that because you will need to develop a backend and database manually. Also, if you're our client, like we said in our problem description, our clients might have multiple databases or data stores that need to be collected and aggregated so we can efficiently use them. Having all the data scattered around can be a problem for, well, any project. So now I would like to make a small detour from our presentation to talk about the IDE that you will be familiar if you choose to go cross-platform. For example, for Xamarin.Forms, the applications are developed in Visual Studio. Now, every .NET developer is probably familiar with Visual Studio. It's a great piece of software. You can do pretty much everything in it. You can even connect to your databases. You can manage your databases. You can develop backend in C# and .NET. It's really great, but it's a massive piece of software, like anyone would know. And it can do whatever you want. It can do everything. Yeah, it's great. Also, Xamarin.Forms and Xamarin Framework support command line interface tools. So you can choose whichever IDE you want, whichever text editor you want for developing, and then compile and build and deploy using command line tools. This is very difficult to set up, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can write in whichever editor you feel comfortable with.
On the other side, the IDE of choice for OutSystems is their Service Studio, which is provided within the platform itself. Yeah, the OutSystems is platform as a service because it provides us several other features that we're going to touch on in the future slides. But for now, you can see possibly some parts of the IDE which is really familiar with, very similar to any other designer or kind of a code IDE, because it has the designer part, the elements scattered around, but the one thing that is different from the other IDEs is that everything is done by drag and dropping the elements that are being previously made and imported or just created within the IDE itself. That is because the entire platform is low-code environment that is focusing basically only on development and the design of the models and the domain itself, so that the code part is generated by the OutSystems platform in their backend, their service. The IDE itself is separated in 4 layers. There are data, logic, interface, and processes. The layers are just there to organize the elements we are working on more efficiently, and so we can use them interchangeably, of course, and basically always the development starts from proper modeling of the data and putting it into a data layer and then working our way towards the processes where we can use automated or manually generated tasks to work with other parts of the program. And on top of the screen, yeah, you're gonna see the big round green button that you're gonna be using a lot when working with the OutSystems, because that's the one-click publish button that basically pushes the entire model you've created onto their servers where the code is generated and compiled and deployed automatically. One bad thing that we're gonna mention a bit later is that the version control, source and version control are also part of that one-click publish process, but we're gonna touch on that a bit later. Yeah, in development stage, like mentioned on the previous slide, it's predominantly domain model-oriented development, which means that the developer is free to spend its time to design architecture more than just flat-out code and set up environments, set up the boilerplate code, and all developers use the more traditional approach are unburdened by the learning curve or processes of specific implementation of things, because everything is so easy and pretty and drag and droppy. But the main focus is then a proper domain model, which has to be clearly identified and modeled as well as a process. Built-in version control that I mentioned is the part of the entire one-click publish deployment sequence that we're going to be very familiar with, which is when you're working alone, it's really handy thing to do because you don't have to worry about much. You just click it and just wait for it to finish its job and you can continue working on. But it can be a problem in a bit larger teams. High abstraction, low code environment means that the entire thing that we are doing is easy to model and easy to use, but the underlying technologies are also well known to any web developer, which are HTML, JavaScript, CSS, SQL, and of course some REST and SOAP calls and all that. So even some more specific changes or closely worked on things that can be changed within the code itself, so you can tinker around as much as you like, but most of the things are done automatically or on that most high level of abstraction. Also, thing worth mentioning is the Integration Studio, which provides you with the opportunity to import and use any legacy C# or Java code, turning it into models for usage in Service Studio and thus into OutSystems. So that's a really handy feature to use if you have some old legacy code base that you want to implement it into new applications.
So on Xamarin.Forms side, everything is developed in code. C# for business logic, XAML pages for the UI. This means the UI is also written. You don't see it, at least not for a while. Yeah. So newer versions of Xamarin.Forms support a live preview of the code that you will implement, how the application will look like on a mobile phone without building it, without deploying it. This can take a while for larger applications when you're building it, when you're developing it. Compiling, building, deploying to a device takes time. So having a preview tool is a great boost to productivity. Also, newer versions support a Xamarin Live Player, which gives you the ability to deploy to a device and then edit the code, the UI code, in your IDE and see those changes immediately, just like developing web pages, which is great. Also, you can use any type of version control when developing Xamarin.Forms. That can be Git, that can be SVN, can be TFS if you like it, but I don't know who does. Also, unit tests, because this is a .NET framework. Any kind of unit test that's supported in .NET, like MS Test, NUnit, XUnit, you can use any of those. This, of course, increases the code quality, and in the later stages of development, reduces the amount of bugs that you need to fix. A lot of the bugs can be reduced or eliminated by good unit tests. Also, Xamarin Framework supports UI tests. They're written in a Ruby-like language, so they do take some getting used to, but you can automate your UI tests even on Xamarin.Forms. Yeah. So after we have done some development and created our application, started developing our application, this is kind of like a plot twist part. This is a part where the client comes in and says, oh, I want to change this, I want to change that. I mean, you probably know this part. There's always one guy, one client, or one manager in the client firm that has this cool new idea, cool new feature that needs to be implemented right away. So if you have good planning, if you're using Agile and stuff like that, you can mitigate those risks. But when developing cross-platform applications in Xamarin.Forms, this can have challenges of its own. First, Xamarin.Forms supports having platform-specific UI. So applications will look like a native Android or native iOS application when it's developed. But this is, of course, great if your client wants this. If your client, for instance, wants to have something very specific to make maybe an application that looks exactly the same on all platforms, that can be tricky, that can be an issue. Because Xamarin.Forms does have support for modifying all the UI elements and making them look exactly what we want. But again, you need some experience with working with native Android, native iOS, native UWP to to properly implement these changes. Also, what I've experienced developing Xamarin.Forms application, because it uses the MVM pattern extensively, it has MVM pattern built in, it's great, but when new inexperienced developers join your team, they sometimes struggle adopting the MVM pattern. It's sometimes hard for them to keep track of it, to know what's going on, what they need to do. So onboarding can take some time when new people come in, when developing Xamarin.Forms. Also, the part when you need to edit to make an application look exactly the same on all platforms, if you don't know or don't have developers who know the specific platforms, that can also be an issue. In my experience, when I was developing an application that was supporting Android and iOS, that was fine. I could work with those platforms, but our client wanted to support UWP. That was an issue because I didn't know UWP. And the client didn't want to spend more money and more time for people who would know that and who would help out. So a lot of time was spent just trying to figure out what the hell to do. And yeah, that can take a lot to, it can take up resources, it can take up your time. So it's something to keep in mind of. Also, the preview tool that I mentioned, it's great, it helps you a lot, but it works well with the default elements and default views. When you're going all custom, everything, making your own stuff, it doesn't work well with that. So it's fine while it works. When it doesn't, you're in trouble because you can't see what you're doing until you deploy to an actual device. That is also one of the challenges. Of course, you only have support for mobile and desktop platform. If you need a backend, if you need a database, you need to hire someone or figure out somehow to get a database or backend up and running, setting up APIs and all that, setting up machines, setting up environments. It takes a while and takes resources. So it's also one of the challenges that you need to keep an eye out.
While on the other side, OutSystems has a lot of other issues and things that crop up during the development. One of the first things I noticed when working on the new project using it was that the UI is always cross-platform, and that's great. You can just define it in one place and it's gonna show up exactly the same way in every single of 3 platforms it supports, because that's just the web view and that's just how the elements are shown. But CSS being CSS, for example, some smaller changes, pixel perfect changes, fixes that you wanted to be done quickly and efficiently can be done so, but sometimes they're just dreadfully terrible to implement, to find out, to root out and to fix. Add to that the amount of different places where it can be stored under pretty UI, and it's just tiresome sometimes because everything is basically hidden away from you under layers of pretty UI and the automated code generation elements. Like I mentioned before, working in large teams on single project can be very challenging on OutSystems simply because the version and source control does not support any branching features that we've all used to in Git or something like that. It's just, everything is just automated and it just pushes everything you work on a central repository where everyone else can see it and just pull it out, and that's a whole lot of trouble with all the merge conflicts, all the changes everyone is working on in the same project. This can be mitigated, of course, with the proper task management or just the entire IDE support it gets, but still it's so frustrating to work with a single repository, single branch. And one of the things that ground my gears the most is how tightly the elements are coupled. What is happening there? We define the data structures from the domain models and then use them to basically build the logic and the UI. When anything out of the ordinary, or when you want to implement any well-known programming pattern, you just run into a lot of different restrictions and problems that the OutSystems just isn't solving, because everything is so automated, so perfectly well placed that any generic type development, generic types, and the development of the separation of responsibilities is just a tough thing to do. So you have to have some time to get used to the fact that you're going to be copy-pasting a lot and then just changing a little stuff here and there, and then letting the platform do the other work for you. So when everything is said and done, when the production is finished and the application is live, the maintenance stage comes in. One of the things that are basically almost a hurdle for any client to bridge is the pricing. The OutSystems has a free option which you can use to develop and train on it, but anything that is production ready has to be under some of their plans, and most of small and even medium sized clients are not going to commit to such a pricing from the very start, especially when the application scope and the entire user base is not big enough. You can check that on their website, of course. But in that, you can get the entire platform offer, because you're going to get the ID, you're going to get their servers, dedicated support, dedicated servers that are secured and maintained on their side. You're going to get a lot of different ways to quickly deploy and quickly finish application and send them to users. So if you have enough, if you have a large enough budget, that can be much better than just scaling everything on the fly and just raising the amount of costs for every single external source service you're gonna need in your application. Good thing is that the entire application is, the platform is supporting a lot of different things out of the box, and only a small team of people can actually maintain it very well and very efficiently. And one of the most frequent questions the clients ask, firstly, out of the box, when they decide the OutSystems, other than pricing, of course, is possibility of vendor lock-in. What does that mean? That means that if you choose the platform, can you sometimes in the future leave it and get all your data and code base with you so you can move on to any other platform you wish? Or is it locked in within their platform, within their service? While the OutSystems platform is not necessarily vendor locking you, you can always pick to choose all the code you created and all the data and merge it or migrate it to wherever you want. It is usually much more efficient, much more useful, and easy to just stay with them and use the services they provide. So you're not exactly vendor locked in, but you have to keep an eye out for that as well.
On the Xamarin.Forms side, and the good thing is that it's free and it's open source. So monthly costs to using the framework itself, the platform itself, are non-existent, apart from the developer costs, developer license costs for every individual platform. But those are different for each platform. So additional costs are maybe more difficult to calculate than on OutSystems, because if you're using a backend or if you're using a database for your application, a remote database, you need to factor in those costs. And those can range from being free to costing thousands and thousands of dollars, depending on your usage. Now, also a big impact on maintenance for Xamarin.Forms applications are the updates to the actual underlying platforms, like an Android releases a new version, iOS or something like that. especially iOS, when they release a new version, a new iOS version, you need to wait for an update for Xcode and everything. Now, Xamarin is pretty quick to catch up to the Apple's updates, but they're not always instant. It can take a couple of days for them to release an update, so you can continue working on and building and publishing your application. Now, the reason I'm mentioning iOS is because I had one not so good experience with that. When Apple released iOS 10, they added one additional icon in their application that you needed to add before publishing to the App Store. Now, you needed to update Xcode to a beta version, you needed to update Visual Studio to a beta version. Everything needed to be beta, pre-release and everything, and it was all broken, and it was barely working, but you had to do that in order to push the application to an App Store to push an update, because it was crucial, it needed to be done quickly. And that is definitely something to be aware of. So keep an eye out when developing Xamarin.Forms for what's happening on every individual platform. What is the next big Apple breaking change in their iOS system? Also, the Xamarin.Forms applications, depending on your backend, of course, can be maintained by a medium-sized team. You can get away if you're a company or if you're a freelancer, working on your own, developing your own application, developing your own backend, developing your own, managing your own database, but that can be very stressful. You need to keep track of everything, keep track of every platform, every database, every backend. It can be very frustrating. It can be very stressful. I did that for a while. It's not a happy place to be. So having more people that know every individual platform, having someone to maintain the backend and the database is very, very good, a very good thing. So this basically concludes an entire process that you might encounter when developing a mobile application. So why, sorry. Sorry. Got a little, excuse me. Please continue. Very sorry about this. So these are some of our personal experiences that we encountered when developing mobile applications, when working on actual projects. So you can check them out on their respective links. This presentation should be available later. So I would recommend using Xamarin and Xamarin.Forms if you have an application that needs to look as close to native platforms as possible. If you, of course, have C# and .NET developers in your team, then this is the perfect solution for you. If you do not, then you shouldn't force people to learn something that they're not comfortable with. Also, you will get great performance using Xamarin.Forms, because in the past there were issues with performance in developing Xamarin.Forms applications because there was little overhead, because running .NET on Android and iOS had some conflicts. But today's phones are just way too powerful to have any impact, or for an end user to actually feel any impact on performance.
And if you have a small team and a client with large budget, the OutSystems platform is a really, really great place to go, because you can just deploy very fast. You can do a really, really good project-based and project-ready applications that are easily available across all platforms. And that's basically it. If you have a client that's willing to invest and that's willing to try out with a basically fixed price, the OutSystems is a really, really good place to start. The cross-platform solutions are not just for rapid prototyping. Of course, they can be a major project that can span years and potentially have a great return of investment for any client that chooses to modernize their services by providing greater reach with the mobile platforms. So do check their website, check the free trial versions, play around a bit, and it's going to be very interesting experience to say the least. If nothing, then just moving to a higher level of abstraction as a developer helps you visualize things better than just bury yourself in code and just try out new things to see how they work without your constant control of every single part of the process. They work very well for now. That's pretty much it from us. We have a few minutes for questions, I guess. So, are there any? Yes?
Systems.
Yeah.
It's something like 12,000 euros a month.
Yeah, that's the.
How much financial sense does it make to do such a big cost, both the client side and the business side of the company?
Well, depending on the reach of the application, sometimes that's the most expensive of the two. The first one is around 6,000, 5,500, yeah, something like that. And considering the fact that they have different, in our example here, they have their own databases that are going to need to be aggregated and worked with. Aggregating them on some different platform or some different service might cost even more depending on the client, of course. So that's why I said that the small or medium-sized teams, companies don't usually go for the OutSystems platform. Only major players that want to have a quick application with a massive support and really good scalability out of the box, and to provide the easy deployment and reach for their customers, can choose OutSystems fairly well. So sometimes it does not pay off, basically. If you're starting off small, don't go with OutSystems.
I have another question if nobody does. What do you think about Flutter?
Of course, there's always that question, yeah.
Yeah, because I think it competes very well against both the speed of development, the simplicity and high level of abstraction, and both the rendering, which makes I think it makes a really good contender, and I would like to know your opinion about it.
Definitely. I'll just start before handing that over to Xamarin guy over here. That's a fairly new platform, and it's really in its early stages of development, or usage for that matter, and it's still going to need some time adjusting to and covering the more platforms, basically, and establishing itself as a platform before it has any value on a marketplace itself. The OutSystems platform is web-based, and you can use it to quickly develop web and mobile applications without any need of adjusting to new platforms, installing new stuff, and so on. But in the future, Flutter could be potentially really good player. So, but we're just still not there yet.
If I'm correct, I think they released the desktop version of Flutter.
Yeah, they're working on most platforms at the same time, yeah.
But again, what you might run into an issue with Flutter is that when you need to do something that's specific for a platform or use a platform-specific library, that can be challenging, because it's nice to be in one language, one environment, using Dart, but when you're going on Android, you need to write Java code. When you're going to iOS, you need to write Objective-C code. And if you don't know Objective-C, you're in trouble, because you can't do it in Dart. In Xamarin, you can stay in the C# environment, do your own thing, do your own stuff, but it will compile and build and deploy for iOS, Android, and every other platform.
Okay, thank you.
So I see you've talked a lot about how it's cross-platform and it's supported on most popular platforms. But what is your opinion on progressive web apps and generally web apps? Because the idea of progressive web apps is to rely on web browser, the program that is on most platforms. And how is, for example, Xamarin or OutSystems better than progressive web apps?
Well, web apps, if you're making an app to go to an app store or Play Store to install for users to install, those apps still need to run in native web view. And those web views sometimes don't support the latest features. Chrome and Firefox and all the most popular browsers on desktops are updated very frequently, and they support the new technologies. But the ones in the underlying platform are not. For example, I know a friend who had an issue when developing an app for iOS. It was written in JavaScript, and it just didn't work. Couldn't get it to work anything, to display anything. And he found out that iOS web view doesn't support async await pattern. That's pretty new. So you can't use that when developing for iOS. He had to rewrite. I mean, it's not that difficult to refactor it, that there are tools to do it, but it's really frustrating because you don't have the nice code that the async await allows you to have.
Yeah, always wrapping things into other things and hoping they work. Yeah, that draws a lot of problems and a lot of different hidden features that you have to be careful of, but that's basically why every platform has its ups and downs, of course. So if you need something relatively simple, quick, and efficient, some of these might be in order. If you have something and the performance is not the main issue of the application itself, if the application has to be really quick, of course you're gonna rather go with the native technologies or something like that. On some other, I don't know, project, you might use something like that, like Flutter even, or something new. So.
Also, if you're a web developer and want to make a mobile application, then using any tool that allows you to use JavaScript, HTML, CSS to make a mobile application, then that's perfect for you. If you are coming from a Java background, then C# might be a better fit because the languages are similar. Also, our company has a lot of .NET developers, and so it's just natural for us to use Xamarin. If we had a lot of .NET web developers, then Cordova or something based on Cordova would be a better fit.
Like OutSystems.
Like OutSystems.
But there is no golden hammer, so choose your technologies wisely. I think that's all.
Anyone else? Nobody? Okay. Thank you.